Hey everyone, welcome to another episode from Pro Engineering. This will be another installment of the Buyer's Guide series focusing on the Super Hornet. This is an interesting one because a lot of these Buyer's Guide series cars focus on cars that I've only gotten recently and really didn't grow up with. This car I actually did. Now, it isn't this car in particular, but the first foray into the Super Hornet was actually the Super Hornet that I bought for my sister on her 10th birthday. At the time, it wasn't very easy to get replacement parts for a Hornet, and my beloved Hornet was showing quite a few signs of wear. That was the car that my sister enjoyed driving, so I felt that we need to do something about this. This was around 1996, and really there were not very many options for the entry-level two-wheel drive buggy. There was a Grasshopper 2, and then next to the Grasshopper 2 was a Super Hornet. Well, since I already had a soft spot for the Hornet, I figured, what the heck, let's go for the Super Hornet. The Super Hornet is a very interesting little car. A large percentage of this is a Grasshopper 2. However, they did change the rear stance quite a lot. And they did this by adding this lower suspension mount. This was a very good attempt at trying to sort out the rear suspension on this car, although it didn't do what it was intended to do because of the factory transmission slider over here, and I'll get into that very shortly. Nevertheless, like the original Hornet, this car did come with oil-filled shocks at the rear, as well as the front. The stock units are black. These are simply some dyed yellow ones that I used to create the look of the Tamiya Super Hornet prototype that was visible on the Tamiya USA page. I've got an image of it up right now. The stock box art on this car I quite like. Some of the cars of that era I didn't really care for. This car, on the other hand, I thought always looked pretty good, if a little bit dated. What you are seeing here is, my own personal take on that prototype Hornet, so it does have more stripes, but that swooshy neon 90s look really, I thought, with the black body, looked good on this car. These are the stock wheels and tires, and although quite attractive, they are painfully weak. These are a new old stock set that I actually purchased when I bought my sister's car, so I always had a spare set of wheels and tires for that. We ended up never using hers either, so hers are new, and we just had another set of rims that we had some Roadhog tires on, and that's what the car was ran with. I have purchased a number of these cars over the years, and it seems that even the lightest road imperfection will put a stress mark on these wheels, not only where the wheel rim hits it, but also on a lot of these spokes. So should you want a Super Hornet or have a Super Hornet and want to run the car, I strongly suggest replacement rims for these cars. Tires also are not magnificent. These pin spikes, to me, I don't know how useful they're going to be. I guarantee you they're going to wear away in one run. And on top of that, these, I believe, are not re-released. These are original wheels and these are original tires, and I don't know if these are available on another Tamiya. The fronts, I believe, are pretty easy to locate. Like the Hornet, the body does come off with 3 body pins. However, unlike the Hornet, this is a hard body. Inside the car, you will see that there are provisions for mechanical speed control. In fact, a lot of the ones that you will see used will have them. As of the filming of this video, these are not re-released, although I suspect that that's going to change shortly. As I'm sure many of you know, I do install my MSCs and broken servos as cosmetics because I think they look cool, but all my cars do run ESCs, and if you do want one of these as a runner, I strongly recommend it. As a runner, you can expect better capabilities than a Hornet, but just barely. The front suspension is quite a lot better. The rear is equally as minimal as the Hornet, but I did mention earlier that the rear end does have a bit of a fatal flaw. The transmission, like the Hornet, is capable of articulation. So here's the slider. So you can twist the transmission very easily. However, upon applying a load to the rear shocks, what will actually happen is the motor will hit the chassis before the shocks fully compress. Now on this car, it doesn't do that any longer because I added this transmission brace that not only braces the transmission in a central position so that when accelerating, the transmission doesn't slap the chassis and make that irritating noise, it also allows the suspension to go into near full compression, which was not possible before. This suspension compression issue definitely takes its toll when landing jumps. The stock setup of this car is actually significantly worse than the stock setup on a Grasshopper 2. The front suspension, like the Grasshopper 2, which this car is based, is better in the fact that it does have oil-filled shocks. So you will have the oil-filled shocks on this car here. However, the stock setup, like the Grasshopper 2, does have no upper link. It is simply a camber gain front suspension, so it only has a bottom arm. And this means the car has some pretty significant camber change as you actually go through the suspension. Again, this car is upgraded with my Ampro double wishbone front suspension, but nevertheless, the oil-filled shocks are significantly better than the Hornet's lack of oil-filled shocks. This car does a weird thing where if you accelerate in reverse with this car, the stock front suspension geometry will cause the suspension to collapse, and because of that, the car will toe inward and result in a very peculiar wobble as you go backwards. It was a trait that I hated so much that I developed this double wishbone front suspension. So from hate, we have created a new front suspension from this car. Chassis is very, very basic, like the Hornet. In fact, other than some proportion changes, it is a near copy of the Hornet in terms of functionality. However, it does have a battery door that we can see here, clips onto place so that the battery will no longer part ways with the car as it did with the Hornet. These chassis, thanks to the re-release of not only the Grasshopper 2, but the release of the Rising Fighter, are relatively easy to get. The Rising Fighter is basically the same car as a Super Hornet, and we'll talk about that in a future video. So chassis are relatively easy to get for this car. The transmissions are standard Midnight Pumpkin fare, so incredibly easy and durable. This rear mount, however, is quite difficult to locate in its original form. I have, in fact, created a direct copy of this for people who have either lost it or broken it or wanted to create a Super Hornet out of a standard Grasshopper 2. So this piece here is available. Let's look at the body in a little more detail here. The body has some very interesting lines. I always felt that the rear spoiler on this almost looked like wings from the side. I always really, really like the look of this body. And it's quite a shame as almost every single Super Hornet I have ever seen is black. Now, this body does come molded in black. If you've got a Super Hornet with missing decals, rest assured that MCI is going to come to our rescue once again as they offer the Super Hornet decal sheet. Again, this car does have some differences because I have modified this one here. These slots in the cowl are a 3D printed panel where I cut this whole area out, put that in here, super glued it into place, and basically filled the super glue in and sanded it all down because this gives the look of the original Hornet over here. I just kind of wanted to mimic that. This car also has a little 3D printed louver to mimic the louvers on the Hornet prototype on the Tamiya USA page. Again, I do apologize because I know I really should be going over box art bodies on a lot of these buyer's guides. Unfortunately, many of my cars simply aren't box art. I really have never been a fan of box art. And it's not because I don't like box art, but it's always been one of those things where I almost feel like the box is telling me that I have to paint it that way. And it's one of those rebellious things where because the box is practically telling me, I refuse to listen to it. So, you know, one of those psychological things, I suppose. Nevertheless, if you did want to get one of these as a basher, a lot of these bodies you will find that are simply not painted black, which is great. I would let them be because they're a black molded body with a cheap set of decals. It can look quite nice very easily. I do want to take this car for a spin, so let's go ahead and do that. Please note that these tires have never been on the ground, and I don't want to start here. I really don't care for mint condition tires because I don't want to drive them, and this car is a pristine example as a car that I can't drive with these wheels and tires because I don't want to hurt them. So I'll put some stock Hornet wheels and tires on it. And just a note that these rims are the same rims that you would find on a Wild One, just in a different color. And you also sell these same rims on a Super G Grasshopper 2 in neon yellow and neon green. I feel like these are even Fox rims, simply plated gold, but I could be wrong. I'm not a massive follower of the Fox. Anyway, so you will see this car with this body and some different wheels and tires. Speed one. It's a lot faster.
Okay.
I really enjoy driving this car as well as the Grasshopper 2. It's always a pleasure to take this thing out. It handles well, it's quiet, it's refined for some on-road light driving. It's difficult to call this car refined by any stretch of the imagination when you're getting more aggressive with your driving, because the fundamental characteristics of a car like the Grasshopper, the Super Hornet, the Rising Fighter, is the fact that they are unrefined, bouncy, pointless, and useless, and also hilarious, and that's why these cars are so great. The question, of course, is, do you want one? The answer for the collector is not as cut and dry as it usually is. This is not one of the original 100 Tamiya kits, and there's a particular cult behind that first 100. I don't understand it because there's a lot of amazing cars that have come out since then. In fact, there's a lot of cars in that first 100 I simply don't like. So I don't quite understand that. If you are an obsessive Tamiya collector and you are into the cars that started it all, this probably isn't for you. Oftentimes people do feel this car is a bit soulless, and I can understand why. It was one of those cars that was built so that Tamiya could make a lot of money cashing in on, sentimental value of the Hornets. And I can kind of see where that came from, but we are finally seeing that next generation that grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s that did have these as kids, and these were brilliant cars to give a child in the 1990s and the early 2000s. It's a great car, but they do tend to lack in that historic value of Tamiya. It seems to be that this car is just kind of lumped into the 1990s, which again, I don't think is a bad thing. This is more of a sentimental value car. If you see the Super Hornet and remember it as a kid, remember it in the hobby shop, then this is probably the car for you. It's an easy car to drive. It's an easy car to drive safely. I mean, I drive this car all the time and I've never rolled it over. But again, I'm a conservative driver with these cars, and this is not a car that I bash. I do have another body for it that I will gladly take on a track and buzz around. But again, I realize that this car is not intended for that kind of use. As of now, this car is simply not available as a re-release, but I suspect that, like everything else, Tamiya will probably get around to this, because why not? So in recap, if you're an obsessive Tamiya collector, this probably is not the car for you. But if you're someone that sees the Super Hornet or the Grasshopper 2 and it strikes a chord with them in their youth, this is probably a car that you're going to really enjoy. Easy to run, easy to get parts for, and I think quite a good looker. Well, folks, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. The Super Hornet for me does have a lot of memories. I actually did race one in the novice class at the racetrack where I was sponsored for quite a while, because at the time my RC10 B2 was beating everybody in the class I was in, and I was not able to move up as my car was not nearly good enough to compete with the factory team drivers. So I slapped the yellow Volkswagen Beetle body on this thing, and I ran this thing hard. Again, not this one, my sister's. She would always go with me to the track, and we would race that car. So I really enjoy this thing. It's a great car. It has a lot of memories for me, and I think that is the demographic that would love this car. Remember, you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Ampro Engineering on both. And before you take off, please check out the band Blue Pinto, who allows me to use their songs in my videos, and a link to their page is in the end credits. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm just going to squeeze the suspension just a little bit, and we'll see you next time.